So, oh.
Hi, good afternoon.
Is your microphone on?
It's red. What does that mean? Yeah, it's on? Okay, great. This actually takes me exactly 3 minutes to read, so perfect. Good afternoon, Planning Commissioners and town staff. I want to thank you for this opportunity for public input. My name is Karen Pilar, and I'm a 35-year resident and homeowner on Deerfield Drive in Truckee. I've been a spokesperson and a liaison for the Deerfield neighborhood throughout the PC1 and Coldstream planning process. And today I just wanted to take a moment to inform you about a proposed legacy trail alignment within the development and some concerns the neighborhood has. Backing up with a little bit of history, at the end of the specific plan process for the PC1 Coldstream development, there were issues with where the legacy trail was showing up on final maps. It was not where it had been previously considered with the neighborhood and the legacy trail foundation. And at the end of that specific plan process, it was left that there were some possibilities for the trail and that an actual alignment would be determined in the future. Well, a couple of months ago, some flags showed up along the back of the property lines of the Deerfield homes, and we were alarmed and a little bit disappointed as we had hoped to weigh in as stakeholders on a trail alignment. However, now that since the specific plan has been approved, we're not able to come to you as a decision-making body. Last month, the neighborhood had the opportunity to walk the proposed trail alignment with the developers and the town engineers. And briefly, Coldstream is proposing that the legacy trail go along the property lines of the existing neighborhood homes and fit into a flat space between the private property lines and the Kinder Morgan high-pressure gas line. In some places, the space between constraints is less than 25 feet wide, and it's pretty impossible to imagine a trail the scale of the legacy trail fitting in that space. Deerfield homeowners have concerns including safety on several levels, as well as compatibility issues with private property and privacy. We're also concerned that this alignment is inconsistent with the town's Trails and Bikeways plan, and we have reached out and shared our concerns with town staff. The Coldstream project site is 175 acres. There's a very large portion of open space that's dedicated open space on the eastern side. The neighborhood is hopeful that town staff and engineers will share our many concerns with Coldstream's trail proposal and work with them on an alternate alignment in this open space. An alternate alignment could result in a safer trail, certainly a more scenic trail, and could be a trail more consistent with both the Trails, Bikeways, and Master Plan and the original Legacy Trail vision. As planning commissioners who represent the community, we know you care about neighborhood concerns, and we know that many of you have a passion for the trails in Truckee, and that you want the Legacy Trail to be the best trail that it can be. The Deerfield neighborhood would like, many of us are here tonight, we would like to extend an invitation for you to come out to our properties if you want a visual look-see and perhaps share any thoughts or feedback that you have. We realize that this is not a planning commission issue at this time, but we just wanted to be certain that you were aware of where the neighbors were at in this process and to extend that invitation and include you in the conversation. So thank you for your time. Carissa has my email. If you want to come out, we would really love to host you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you this evening. My name is Laura Kodris, and I am the Vice President of the Carmel Ski Club. I am here tonight to register an early concern about the Legacy Trail project, a Class 1 bike trail that will be constructed by the Tykert Land Company just south of Deerfield Drive from Highway 89 to Donner State Park entrance. The Carmel Ski Club owns 2 lots that are adjacent to the planned route. The members of the Carmel Ski Club are supportive of open access bike trails in Truckee, and specifically the Legacy Trail project, as it will provide access to the beautiful views of the surrounding terrain. However, we have some serious concerns about public safety given its current route. On July 7th, Mike Isle, the Tykert representative for this project, and Martin Wood, the SCO Planning, Engineering, and Surveying, Inc., provided residents of Deerfield Drive with an on-site review of their most current trail route. The route indicates that the trail would cross an aging petroleum pipeline adjacent to the corner of the Carmel Ski Club lot, and subsequent email from Mr. Isle noting our input does not dispel this concern. Our further investigation of this pipeline owned by Kinder Morgan Incorporated has elevated our concerns, of which we would like you to be aware, even before Tygart submits its plans to the Planning Commission. Construction activities over or near the pipeline could result in damage to or rupture of the pipeline, with the outcome being a petroleum spill, fire, or even an explosion, as past incidents with Kinder Morgan pipelines indicate. Among them, in April 2005, this same pipeline leaked just east of Kingvale into the upper portion of Summit Creek, impacting the Donner Lake watershed. Other accidents have resulted in deaths. This pipeline was constructed in the late 1950s, making it over 60 years old. Its structural integrity is likely declining. We fear that both the trail construction and subsequent traffic over the pipeline will accelerate its deterioration and become a significant safety concern and an environmental hazard for those on the trail and others nearby. Although we have other privacy and security concerns, the risks associated with the pipeline are our top priority. We would like to see the new route plan from the collaboration between Tygart and the town of Truckee include explicit construction specifications to mitigate the aforementioned concerns. Ideally, moving the trail's pipeline crossing significantly away from our properties. Given the mandate of the Planning Commission to provide a balanced view of development of Truckee, taking into consideration a project's unintended consequences and its impact on the environment and public safety, we anticipate that when the project reaches the Commission, you will carefully check to ensure our concerns have been addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So we're going to close public comment now. So for items 5, 6, and 7 on the agenda, we do not have any items in there. Approval of minutes, minor review of items, or major review of items. So we'll move on to item 8, which is the presentation section, and item 8.1. This is the general plan update and land use alternatives presentation, and Danielle is going to be taking the helm here.
Thank you, Vice Chair Tarnay. So tonight, I have a bit of a longer presentation for you than I would normally give, and in part because this is a lot of information for us to go through. We thought it'd be helpful for the Planning Commission to have this opportunity, in part because not all of you have participated in the general plan update process so far, but also to allow the public another opportunity to hear some of this information that's been previously available, both in our virtual workshops, on our online survey, and then also in our in-person workshops. So some of this information may look a little repetitive, but it's purposeful so that we keep saying the same information and sharing that. I do have some new information I'll share at the end also. So for those community members who've participated, you will hear something new tonight if you stay tuned. Bit of an overview for what we're doing tonight. This isn't any type of action that the Planning Commission will take. This is truly a presentation. It's an opportunity for us to share the information that's been collected since we started the general plan update process. It's at a very high level. So I'm not going to get into sort of every single detail of what we've been working on, but I think it will give you a good flavor. And then if you have questions, we can work on those at the end. We will focus on the land use alternatives phase because that's the phase that we're in now. And we'll cover sort of the history that we went through and coming up with focus areas, the alternatives themselves, the comparisons, and then my new information, which is the emerging concepts. So that's sort of fresh off the press of some of the recent workshops we've had in the last month. And then we'll give you a little bit about next steps.
Hang on one second. Can you guys hear her? Okay.
Okay. I don't want to eat the microphone. I know with masks it's a little more challenging, so if you can't hear me, just say so and I'll talk louder. We're going to start with some of the fundamentals. Why are we doing a general plan update and what is a general plan? So every city, town, and county in California has to have a general plan. That's a requirement. What you do with your general plan can be very specific to your jurisdiction, so long as you meet sort of the minimum requirements, which is addressing certain topics. So those are kind of listed on the screen of some of the things that we have to address. We have to look at our land uses. We have to look at noise. We have to talk about safety, We have to talk about sort of our transportation mobility. And then communities have options to add things that are very specific and unique to who they are. So for Truckee, we currently have a community character kind of chapter that we talk about in our general plan, and then we also have economic development. But ultimately, the reason you create a general plan is so that you have a long-term framework for future development. It's really on a 20-year time frame that we're looking at, and it's just so that we can plan for sort of what our community needs are in a comprehensive way. And it really does work as that blueprint so that as we're looking at whether it's projects or land acquisition or changes, that we have this policy document to go back to and reference that's been worked on by the community for the community and represents our vision, our goals, and who we want to be and how we're going to get there. So it's a very comprehensive document that we use all the time with all of our decision making that we do. And it's a good idea to keep it fresh because there are a lot of changes that happen over a 20-year time frame. So we generally are updating them about every 10 years. Looking forward to sort of what is the Planning Commission's role. The Planning Commission is in that critical seat for the council and kind of filtering all the different levels of input that come in at some very key milestones for the community and the council to kind of consider. So I put those on the screen here as the phase of the land use alternatives, kind of the policy work, and then also the environmental work. Those are really the major milestones. It's not to say that the Planning Commission can't weigh in on other aspects of things, but those are really sort of the critical paths that we're making formal recommendations to the council. The community can make input to the staff, to the council, and the Planning Commission all throughout the general plan update process. But it does give you sort of a flavor of all the different things that you're going to get as far as participation. We started the 2040 general plan process in November of 2018. And one of the first things that we worked on was the existing conditions report. So this is a comprehensive kind of background document that our consultant, Ascent, prepared to really just kind of get a sense of where the community was at the time that report was prepared, and to be able to use that for discussion purposes with our visioning process, and then ultimately as we were looking at sort of what sort of options for land use alternatives we wanted to have, what those would look like. So we are in the land use alternatives phase, and we've been in this phase for about a year and a half now. And once we've come up with sort of a preferred land use alternative, we'll then move on to general plan goals and policies. So that's digging into those chapters of the general plan, those elements that we have, and looking at, what's stale and can be removed, what we've already accomplished, what's new in the community that we haven't previously addressed, and then go through and change those to reflect all of the community's interests. Concurrently, we're also working on an update to the downtown specific plan, and we're also doing climate action work. We made a decision at the council level to not have a separate climate action plan, although all of that will be included within the general plan as a climate action element. So still that level of review, but combining it all into one comprehensive process. And then the other components that finish out your general plan update are the environmental review and then the final document adoption dates. So just real quick on the screen here, I kind of added the Planning Commission's role. As you can see that earlier on, there wasn't a significant amount of involvement from the Planning Commission other than the representation the Commission has with the General Plan Advisory Committee. So when the council created our update process for the general plan, there were some choices that they made. They decided that they wanted to have a General Plan Advisory Committee. So that committee can represent the variety of stakeholders within the community and really use them to kind of do the difficult work of going through all of the different options and decisions and kind of recommendations, as a group, and be able to present that to the community, the Planning Commission, and the council. So you have your representation from the Planning Commission on the General Plan Advisory Committee, and they've been doing that work on your behalf. Because tonight we're going to talk about the land use alternatives portion of the general plan update, it's helpful to kind of understand why we talk about land use. And what you see on the screen here is a snapshot of our current general plan. This is a map that's included in the general plan, and it's titled General Plan Land Use Map. So on this map, all these different colors represent what we call land use designations. A land use designation is really just an area that's been identified for a specific purpose. So that's why there's the variety of colors, that some of them represent residential, some of them represent non-residential uses. But ultimately at a very high level of sort of where in the community do we want to see these different land uses happen. It's important to identify in your general plan, and it's also a requirement, your intensity and density. And if you think about it in terms of density for residential, so how many homes in a certain area, and then intensity can also reflect residential. So is it an apartment building versus a single family home? But then equally when you talk about non-residential, you talk about sort of intensity, like how much can you put in a certain area? And we'll go over that in a little bit more detail as some of these other slides come up. This map is sort of the foundation of what you have in your general plan, and you build off of that. So you create policies, you have goals that really dig into this map. When we talk about doing a land use alternatives process, it's really the question of, should we change things? Do we need to change anything? And what does that look like? A lot of people are more familiar with the zoning aspect of what happens in planning, and that's really at a lower level. You kind of look at it as an umbrella where your general plan is at that very high level, and then underneath it you have lots of different tools, and your zoning is one of those tools. So it's really at that more specific level. The land use alternatives process, we did start back in fall of 2019, and the GPAC really, General Plan Advisory Committee, put a lot of work into discussing what should change within the community, sort of what their goals and priorities were, what should be the focus, and spent quite a bit of time working through different phases, different options within the community. And then we used that to develop information that we used for these more recent workshops. So if you kind of see where we're at within just the land use alternatives process phase, we've just come out of doing some of these workshops. The next step will be for the General Plan Advisory Committee to talk about a preferred alternative, which might be a multitude of recommendations, and then ultimately going in front of the Planning Commission. So we really wanted to give the Commission and the community opportunity tonight to hear this information before you have to make a decision, so that there's not that same level of pressure of trying to make that decision while you're still absorbing the information. So you have time, you can ask questions, you can take it home and think about it later. You don't even have to ask the questions tonight, but it's on your radar and you have the opportunity to look at it sort of while you have time. Ultimately, what this will result in is the council saying this is the preferred alternative that we want to move forward through the rest of the process. Maybe that has no changes. Maybe it looks just like the map I showed you before with the 2025 general plan. Maybe it has a few changes. Maybe there's some focused areas that the community supports and that the Planning Commission and Council support. Maybe it's more extensive. That's the process that we're in right now, is to kind of see where that sort of comfort level is, where the community's vision is, and be able to match those together. So there have been options that we've shown in this land use alternatives process that people disagree with. There are ones that people like and support. There's been things where there's no consensus. It's really for us to kind of flesh all of that out right now and get a sense of what's going on. So in our recent engagement that we had, and this is only a snippet of the public engagement that we've had throughout the general plan update process, but I think because it's fresh and people have been tuning in, it's helpful to kind of see what those numbers look like. So when we did the virtual workshop, we had 106 people attend. That did include staff, but a very high number for us for kind of virtual participation. Jen and I went down to the farmers market for the Saturday farmers market, and we weren't sure if anyone would want to talk to us, and we were busy the entire time, which was really amazing that the community is willing to kind of take time out of their Saturday and talk to us. We also gave out copies of the briefing book, so that's sort of that packet that you got with this presentation agenda. And then we also handed out questionnaires, which were the paper version of the online survey. We did the in-person open house here at Town Hall and had 68 people attend who were not town staff. So pretty high numbers for public participation for the community in general. We haven't always had that high level, which is usually an indicator of just community interest in expressing their ideas about what's going on in the community. The biggest one, which we just got this number this morning because the survey just closed, was 465 responses. So that's really impressive. I commend the community for doing that level of work with us to be able to provide that level of information so that we can use that. Our consultant really hustled and compiled some of this already. So when I get to the end of the presentation, that's the new information. I'm going to give sort of some emerging concepts out of this work already. We'll have more of it refined for the GPAC meeting, but it is kind of interesting to see sort of the early hints at what information and kind of things the community was looking at. Which kind of takes us into, we're going to get into some of the more specifics at this point of the presentation. And I will apologize in advance a little bit that we have a script for this, in part because it's similar information to what Ascent did. So I'll do my best to paraphrase where I can, but I don't want to miss some of the more important information that they shared. So it's not my typical style, but I think just because the community may want to watch this, whether they're doing it live or not, I think it's good for consistency to have some of that. So when we created this land use alternatives briefing book, we did this in part so that we could really capture some of the work that the GPAC had done and some of the earlier feedback we had gotten from the community. And part of that was, what are our goals for this land use alternatives process? What are things that the community's already expressed as, current, ongoing, and foreseeable challenges? What do we think are opportunities within the community, maybe to fix some issues that had been developing out of our current general plan? And then ultimately, if we're going to show the community sort of a range of options to consider, what do those look like? So the briefing book really compiled a lot of that information and was based off of several different versions of kind of focus area studies, town-wide studies, and a lot of GPAC meetings to get to that level. Ultimately, similar to your general plan, starting with goals is really helpful because then you can kind of understand how we're going to approach this, sort of what are the goals that were developed. And the GPAC had already come up with a draft vision statement, which is something that all general plans have. They're very unique to each community. It really helps you kind of understand who that community is. It really helps solidify the differences between your community and someone else, and then sets the tone for how you're going to preserve, grow, change in the future. And within that, you create these goals to kind of implement that vision. And so these, shown on the screen here are really what we're driving sort of the ideas within the land use alternatives process. Everything from character to our development patterns, making them sustainable, looking at the river. The river was a focal point, addressing our industrial demand, and looking at housing opportunities. So these shouldn't seem like new concepts because a lot of these are very similar to concepts that we have in our current general plan. I think it just helps define what GPAC was looking at based on their review process themselves. So what does that mean? That means that we had some big ideas that kind of came out early on of things that we wanted to take a look at. So we have our big ideas here. And the first one that we have on the screen here is about encouraging mixed use in corridors and neighborhood centers. And the concept of mixed use here is about providing flexibility, flexibility within land use designations, and ensuring that we have housing and jobs in a closer area so that people can really get their daily service needs without having to get in a car, kind of that kind of concept. And it's not a typical development pattern for us, I will say, that we have a lot of residential land that's single family, that's in different nodes within the community, but that has come up as part of the public participation. Planning commissioners, council have all kind of talked about it, is how do we go back into our residential neighborhoods and change them in some way to accommodate more community members? The state's already working on that. They have SB 9, which is an option to create kind of a duplex option with an ADU, so an accessory dwelling unit, or a junior accessory dwelling unit within single family zones. And it's working its way through the process. I mean, they may adopt something before we do, or as a community, we may decide we want to adopt something before the state does. But it is something that's being discussed and could provide an opportunity that isn't the same as a higher density kind of land use designation within that. Another important idea was about our economics. So we do rely on tourism and construction quite a bit. And so how do we change that to have that year-round sustainable economy? And a lot of that was looked at with sort of what's been happening on the ground. Pioneer Commerce Center, for example, was intended to be industrial. Over time, it's been a little less industrial, but still some interesting uses that support the community. And how do we kind of grow that in a way that we can have higher paying jobs, but still support small businesses and provide that opportunity? So that's where the business innovation zone and land use designations kind of came out of the discussion. And really could have things like coffee roasters or customer service uses. I mean, there's a lot of variety that we could look at within that. And then the final option is kind of smart growth and resource preservation, which this alternative focuses on growing up in key locations near the downtown, so in areas that are already developed rather than going out into our open space areas. Fundamentally, these are all just good planning concepts. So I think that's great that we all ended up in the same place. But of course, we recognize that we have some challenges. We're doing a general plan update process with the uncertainty of COVID-19. And there's been a lot of questions about, the existing conditions report was sort of, pre-pandemic, and we know that there's more community members here. What are we planning for at this point? Are we growing faster than we anticipated? What are we projecting? Lots of questions, so that's definitely a challenge. We've looked at also some of the legal constraints that we have specific to housing sites, the ability to downzone, the density for our housing sites. Increased wildfire risk, very, very big deal. Not something that's been heavily talked about in our 2025 general plan, but again, fundamental to how we plan our community because it's a huge risk. And then climate change, which is probably the biggest risk and topic for us to address that, again, isn't currently covered holistically in the 2025 general plan. But depending on what decisions we make with our land use alternatives process, that's going to have a substantial influence on how we address climate change. So these are all really important challenges for us to look at that are constantly at the back of our mind as we're going through, whether it's the land use alternatives process or we get into the policy work. So it's kind of both of those. The next couple of slides are really more specific to the density and intensity points that I was talking about earlier. And I think it's still helpful for us to have these slides kind of incorporated within this presentation because a lot of times I get the questions when we're at workshops of, well, I don't understand, why we allow development to happen in this certain location, and like, how do you, as a planning department, know what someone can and can't build? And at your general plan level, because you're not getting into like your setbacks and your height, you keep it at this higher level and you talk about it in terms of floor area ratio for your non-residential development, and then you talk about it more at the residential density level when you talk about housing. So they really work together to shape what the community looks like. And the examples on the screen here are just to kind of show you the variety that our current general plan, we have a 0.2 floor area ratio for all of our non-residential development. And you can see on the ground what that's translated into. We have a lot of parking lots kind of facing the street with the buildings behind. The parking oftentimes has become the dominant feature of the sites. So that applies to both commercial uses and industrial uses, for example, where if you're more, I would say, progressive at this point in looking at changing those, then you can really mix up the opportunities for getting it more in line with a form-based code where you can better define what you want on those sites and which areas could be open space, things like that. So that's something that we're asking the community weigh in on, the Planning Commission and Council to weigh in on, is should we adjust that? Is the 0.2 that we've been working under still sufficient, or should we be a little more aggressive in changing that? And if so, what does that look like? And what parts of town would that be appropriate? I mean, should we talk about it in different land use designations differently? And then the pictures on the screen below kind of reflect when you look at the differences between that. So the Safeway Shopping Center, for example, is at that current 0.2. So a lot of it is just covered with surface parking. It's generally a one-story product where when you get into more of the higher densities, you could have 2 to 3 stories but maybe you have more of the land available for open space or public space than you would if you just had it kind of consumed with parking. So those are options for us to think about as we're working through the general plan update process. Residential density is another one where we're all familiar with our single family homes because we have a lot of them in Truckee, and we have more recently had a lot of apartment complexes built. But what we don't have is sort of that in-between product. We don't have a lot of townhomes. We don't have kind of the garden apartment concept that you might see in places like Santa Barbara, where it might be 8 to 12 units around a little courtyard, the parking's tucked behind. We just don't have the same variety that other communities have. And that speaks to our housing element, where we've talked about trying to create diversity of housing types for the community, and yet we haven't been that successful at doing that. And so that is an opportunity with this discussion of changing land use designations is, do we think we can do better than what we've been doing? Because we haven't been accommodating our community's needs. And if we want to stick with the current 2025 general plan, we definitely can. We just may not get more variety of housing types than we've had in the last 20 years. So it's just something to think about. We also have some related planning efforts going on that do influence the discussions that we have with the general plan update process. So I mentioned the downtown specific plan previously because that's wrapped under the umbrella of the general plan update. But we're also doing a corridor study of the Donner Pass Road corridor, which is a major landowner and community partner within the Gateway area that's looking at doing a master plan. So do you want, Susie? Like 5 minutes?
Yeah, so if we did 5 minutes, it's by my watch,
Okay.
5:42, that'd be 5:47.
Okay.
You were on a roll. Sorry to cut off right there.
Okay, hopefully we are back and we are back streaming and we're gonna
We are. So we're still talking about the general plan update process, and we had just gone through focus area 1 for Donner Lake, and now we're moving on to focus area 2, which is the Gateway Donner Pass Road area. And we have option 1 of our current general plan. So you can see that this is one of our heavy commercial areas within the community, and we do have some potential for additional multifamily that could be built in addition to some single family within this area. Option 2 is the lower intensity of the new mixed use options that we have. So again, I mentioned that there's 4. And some of this depends on how the community feels about like heights of buildings, scale of buildings, kind of intensity of development, because the options really vary from sort of the same pattern that we have with our current general plan of the 1-story, lots of parking, up to things that could be, 2 to 4 stories depending on where we go. And so I think this is, an area for the community to, look at pretty closely. And we did get a lot of feedback about this area with our survey work. And really trying to grapple with these notions of, do we intensify? And if we do, is it just for housing? Is it for commercial? And what does that look like? So option 2 replaces the commercial designation with a mixed use low. So if you look at the map, that's kind of shown as a pink area, and increases the floor area ratio and also increases the residential densities. So this option has more of that 1 to 2 story option. The public areas, which is shown in light blue, would be modified to allow for workforce housing in conjunction with education facilities. I will say that since we've had the workshops, there has been discussion about, well, should it just be specific to like a campus or a school? There are a lot of lands within our community owned by other public agencies that are currently designated as public facility. And should we look at those as opportunities for those agencies to add workforce housing for their employees? So that's something that's on our radar. We didn't include it necessarily in this discussion because this is reflecting the work that we had already done, but it's something for us to think about when we talk about changing floor area ratio or talking about changing the densities. Option 2 also designates the hospital with a campus designation. So that's shown in a dark blue on the screen. So it's under option 2. And that would, again, reflect the hospital's interest to have a campus master plan. Really what that would look like if that was adopted as part of our general plan is that we would have this land use designation specific to them, and then there would be policies that reference, consistent with the adopted campus plan for the hospital, something to that effect. And so in the future, our Planning Commission Council would be tasked with looking at that master plan and making their decisions about if something's compatible or not. So it really does create a defined area for the hospital. It would create a process for them to have all of their interests under one comprehensive plan for themselves, which is their master plan. The other area that's identified within the Gateway area is the MacGyver site. So that's shown as the green icon on the screen. It looks like a little tree. And in option 2, this would be redesignated as hospital campus versus what we have in our current general plan, which is currently residential. So there are some options, kind of going through this. The MacGyver site is one that the community has talked about for quite some time. It was upzoned for residential uses as part of our housing element, and there's been a lot of interest in having that go back to a more open space designation. The current designation allows for 16 to 18 units an acre. So that was part of our shortfall in our last housing element for our regional housing needs assessment. But it is something that the community is asking to have shown differently than the options that have been presented so far. There are some challenges with it, and we can answer questions about that afterwards if we want, but we would have to look for either another site to accommodate the density, figure out a way to compensate the hospital who currently owns it. There's just some other things for us to think about as part of that. So this kind of shows the MacGyver site. So we're talking about the area next to the hospital that's kind of right up against the freeway, and that's part of the concern is the proximity to the freeway. Is that an appropriate site for housing? some of the things that came out of some of these workshops is that, if the hospital owns it, would they be looking at developing it for their employees or for, senior housing or something that doesn't have a community need? And we don't know the answer to that yet. I think they're in their exploration phase as part of their master plan development of what they think is appropriate for that site, but they're equally listening to the public feedback that we're getting. We have regular meetings with them. And so as we present some of this information, they're getting it also and are able to kind of consider that with their master plan process themselves. We did include a policy option to study creating the MacGyver site as open space. And I know that sounds like it's not definitive, and that's a little bit on purpose, but in part, we don't really know what that other option is. It could be something like a transfer of development rights program. It could be a purchase. It could be other things. But it would take some time for us to kind of dig into what those are. And you can identify that in your general plan and say, like, here's a policy. The policy is create this program. But you still have to come up with a land use designation for it regardless. So that's where some of this discussion has been happening with the public input that we've gotten. So 2 more options that we had included within the Donner Pass Road area. So we have options 3 and 4, and the only difference between option 2, which we had called as our mixed use low, and then the options shown on the screen here, which are kind of 3 and 4, are the areas that are shown as mixed use. So option 3 is the commercial area around Donner Pass Road would be mixed use medium and would allow for a higher floor area ratio and more housing units that were shown in the previous one. So getting up into the 12 to 24 units an acre. And would probably be 2 to 3 stories versus the 1 to 2 stories with the option 2. And then the highest intensity we're calling mixed use high. We're very creative with our names, by the way. I think you'll see that in this process. That's some planner humor. Which this actually pushes into a 2.0 floor area ratio. So this is the highest one that we've identified. And I said 2 to 4 stories, but realistically could even potentially get to 5 stories. So we were really kind of testing the limits with the community of, do you think this is an area where we could accommodate different housing opportunities? And if so, like, what does that look like? Is it 1 to 2 stories, 2 to 3, 4 to 5? What is that? And equally, we've been asking the same question with the Innovate Gateway process. And so these overlap on purpose, and we're working to have these kind of sets of information together so that when the Planning Commission and Council are asked to make that recommendation on the preferred alternative, you have even additional detail about this critical part of town than you would have had if we had not done this process. So that's a unique opportunity that we had. Moving on to focus area 3, so 89 North. This area is kind of a hodgepodge when you look at it from a land use designation perspective, in that you have everything from the area around Pioneer Commerce Center to Gray's Crossing, and then you have the middle school and a lot of different housing sites kind of wrapped within. And so I think the community struggled a little bit when we were asking the questions with the more recent workshops of, should we increase housing density on any of these sites? Like, what do you think of the industrial? Is it really industrial? There wasn't a lot of consensus, I would say, about the housing densities, but I think people were generally supportive of looking at the Pioneer Commerce Center as business innovation, because that really reflects what's out there now. That way back when we were asking ourselves the same question we're asking now, how do we get stuff off the river? Pioneer was kind of that receiver site for industrial, and through our planning processes, we allowed for more than just industrial to be built within Pioneer Commerce Center. And over time, because of demand and interest by the property owner and a variety of other reasons, it's been a lot different than just a true industrial park, that you have a lot of kind of different businesses that have some aspect of industrial uses. Maybe they have some warehousing, they have some things that they're building on site that are maybe a little noisier than you would have in like an office area, but aren't at the same level of, outdoor storage or things like that. And so that was a question we were asking within this focus area, is what do we change if we change anything? And so there's not a lot of differences, honestly, between option 1 and option 2 here. we've got our current general plan, and then we look at sort of the Pioneer Commerce Center and some of the housing options within Grace Crossing itself. So we're really just looking at introducing, like I mentioned before, with the some of the sites where the school districts are, is being able to do kind of workforce housing at the middle school site. So that's that public facility zoning. Rethinking kind of Pioneer Commerce Center area of should that be this business innovation, and then how do we encourage workforce housing, or is this appropriate site for that? So option 3 and 4 are only slightly different than option 2, just because of the density ranges for the housing, and mostly within the Grace Crossing specific plan. So we have sites that are currently designated for that 6 to 12 units an acre, and then option 3 would be designating the parcel for more of the 12 to 18 units per acre. So this is one that we're probably going to dig a little bit deeper on with the community and kind of ask that question. GPAC will be asked the same question of, what do we think is an appropriate kind of housing density for this area if we're looking at changing anything? So it could be anything from that kind of small single-family home, small lot development up to the option for multi-family apartments. Focus area 4 is West River Street. We had a lot of lively dialogue with GPAC about West River, and I felt the passion for the river, just like when we did the 2025 general plan, the passion was about downtown. So this, in my mind, is really the evolution of that discussion that we had with creating our 2025 general plan, kind of that heart of the community is the downtown, but in part the river, and how do we actually embrace it in a way that can be effective and different than what we've been doing in the past. And so again, we spent a lot of time talking about this and came up with a multitude of options for the community to consider. Option 1 with the current general plan, option 2, more of that employment focus, which, again, these were all very interesting and different for the GPAC to talk about. I mean, there wasn't consensus even on showing this range of alternatives because there were so many different ideas and kind of recognition of the challenges of this area that, we've been talking about this. We have the river strategy. We've, been creating some incentives to have businesses relocate, but it's still primarily industrial, and it's a missed opportunity for us to embrace the river. So let's see, we'll talk about option 2. This really maintains the industrial designation that we have now on the north side. And then the south side would be that less intensive business innovation. So think more like Pioneer Commerce Center, but still has kind of that industrial job focus. It could also accommodate live work units, and then kind of those smaller business ownership opportunities. And it's really kind of driven by the mindset of preserving and improving this as a job center, which is different than some of the other options. When you get into option 3, that's more of that balance of jobs and housing, versus option 4 is really moving in a completely different direction. So for option 3, you still have the opportunity to mix up housing and employment. It just designates a larger portion of the area for that business innovation designation. So a broader mix of industrial, kind of customer service uses on both sides, and the live work opportunity, and applies the highest density of mixed use in both the commercial and the residential, kind of on this with some emphasis on housing on the south side. Option 4 would require a separate planning process, and that's in part because it's just very complex to look at all the different issues associated with the fact that we have existing owners who don't want to change their industrial uses. So do we have to create some sort of incentive program? How do we deal with sort of shifting jobs out of this area? And if we do change it out of industrial, are we accommodating that somewhere else within the community? I mean, that was something we talked about quite extensively, of where does that industrial go if it's not here? Because we're already stretched right now to accommodate our industrial needs. We have to plan for more in the future, so this would be adding to that. What does that look like? The separate planning process is something that could provide an opportunity to take the river strategy and really put it at an implementation level, versus right now it's a strategy. So this is one that I think a lot of the GPAC members were really interested in having the community weigh in on. because it's very different than what's there now, but really reflects that longtime interest the community's had to have that open space along the river to, allow for a variety of housing in an area that right now is pretty heavily industrial. And then option 5 is just a combination. So you can see there's a lot of different combinations within this. And the great thing about this process is that you don't have to pick only what we've shown. So we're starting to see, even with some of the early feedback that we've gotten, that people like aspects of certain maps that we have. And so what ultimately could get adopted could be something that looks like the 2025 general plan with a few areas that are changed, or it could look like some of the options that we've shown on here for West River, but not for Gateway, for example. So it is kind of an opportunity to mix and match, and that was the concept we had with the puzzle pieces with the virtual workshop, is to kind of get a sense of where people thought there were growth opportunities and where it was appropriate to look at that. And then our last focus area that we were talking about is the Glenshire area. And we kind of focus on two things. There's a small kind of neighborhood commercial area. Should that change? Should we allow for that to be more of that neighborhood mixed use level? And then the former Canyon Springs site, which has mixed land use designations now between open space and residential. And we've talked about some of the challenges with the state's restrictions on us downzoning residential properties, but we recognize that the community for a long time has asked to have the council and planning commission discuss having this area as open space. And so the options that were presented were based on feedback that we got through the process and over the years of working with the community in recognition of some of the constraints that we have. Option 2 would be a separate planning process where maybe the development areas can be better defined. The mapping that we have with our land use designations right now probably don't accurately reflect what's on the ground. That although we've called areas as open space, when you actually map them out, it's probably missing some areas that would be better set for open space now or could be different for development. And so the planned community option would really allow for that level of kind of work in identifying the constraints and then taking the density that's been allocated for housing and deciding where it would be most appropriate for that to go. So that could be something that's a more clustered development. It could be something that's, attached. It's really an opportunity to have that level of discussion. And then what we showed under this option are some of the policies that could be added if there was interest by the community to look at this. So everything from what we have in our current general plan about kind of coordinating these properties, because there's 6 different properties and a few different property owners for this site overall, and kind of how do we ensure that that's being looked at comprehensively, to kind of a trail network, to sort of the concerns that the community's raised about wildfire, about homes in this area. Is this on the edge of town? Is this an appropriate site? So that really allows for kind of that future discussion. And then the other option that we included within that is the open space preservation option, which still preserves the development potential that's identified in the current general plan, but also creates a policy option to study the ways that this could be preserved as open space. So whether that's land purchase, the transfer of development rights option I mentioned before, kind of packages those up to say, maybe we need to look at ways to preserve this as open space. We can't do that right now as part of the general plan process, because that is a totally separate level of work that we would have to get to. But from a community's perspective in talking about Glenshire, we have heard very loud and clear, and we have for years, that the communities, particularly those that live in Glenshire, would like to see this area as open space. And so we're cognizant of that, and we're trying to find a balance of interests there, recognizing that we do have some constraints, both by the state and the property owner's interest, to do something with this site. The one thing that I tried to kind of get across when I was doing this station for the in-person workshop was that we haven't had a community discussion at this point about, yes, it's designated for single-family homes for a portion of it, but what if those homes were at some, income restricted level for the community and could meet a workforce housing need that we can't meet in other land that we have within the community? And this isn't a surprise, me talking about this, because I've had this conversation with the property owners, but I think that's something that we were trying to get the community to discuss is there's trade-offs. A lot of these options that we have really are trade-offs, and it's townwide, it's focus area, it's comprehensive. And so that's why I'm giving this presentation, even though we've already done this once before, because I think the more the community hears, that there's trade-offs and options, the better educated they're going to be to provide you and the council their feedback on this and really get to the same issues that the staff struggles with and that you'll struggle with is these trade-offs. Which then leads us to our townwide alternatives that we have. So we included a lot of this information directly in the briefing book so that as community members were participating in our workshops and doing the survey, they could kind of do this comparison. So it's, at a very high level, but I think it's still helpful for the community to have and to kind of see. And this is really just giving you a sense of, if you wanted to do hybrids too, like how that could change things. So it's just a helpful tool. We have what we're calling Alternative A, so our current general plan. So this would be if the community, came out and said, we like our current general plan, we think it's going to accommodate our need for the next 20 years, we don't want to see any changes, then this would be the option where we would do that. And then we have Alternative B, and we named this one Four Seasons Economy, which maximizes sort of our commercial and industrial development in comparison to other alternatives. So you'll kind of see themes with these. I wouldn't focus so much on the titles that we gave them. It was just really to have the ability to talk about them, where if we kind of just called it Alternative B, it might be harder for us to kind of comprehend what the differences are with those. But this one really does have more of that kind of jobs, housing, balance option. So this slide just kind of shows what those key changes are. So we are introducing that mixed use low designation. So that would be more in the Donner Lake Glenshire areas.
We just lost our screens.
Oh, well, we love having technical difficulties in this building.
Did you lose yours as well, Mr. Freeman?
Yeah, mine's out.
Okay. I moved my footstool. I hope it wasn't me. I'm going to dive under and look. Hold on.
I know, let's pause for a minute so we can look and see if that's something that's fixable. And then if not, we'll talk about whether you can see this screen well enough.
The public watching can still, I assume, see the one projected.
Can I look under?
Yes, I smashed my footstool.
Oh, I bet that.
I love our problem-solving skills. This is great. Okay, so we were talking about townwide, so the Four Seasons economy. We went through this one. And we have our Alternative C, which focuses on achievable housing, so more variety of housing types relative to the other alternatives. And you can see the reason that we came up with these kind of themes is based on testing kind of where we think the community's priorities are and based on the goals that the GPAC had come up with already. So it's really helpful when you go through and synthesize all this information to look at these kind of while you're looking at the focus areas themselves. And I give that to GPAC because GPAC spent a lot of time talking about, well, is it townwide, is it focus, which one? And ultimately we settled on it's both. I mean, you have to really look at it from both lenses, and that's an important part of getting through a land use alternatives process is deciding how you're going to tackle it. And for our community, it's at both levels because we want to make sure that we're meeting our demand, but we're not over meeting our demand, and that we are looking at our unique character in both our neighborhoods, but then our commercial centers as well. So this kind of summarizes, the differences that, again, I think there's maybe some misconceptions that, this whole process is really to, add growth to the community, and trying to change that mindset a little bit, that it's really about what are those missing opportunities or things that we haven't been able to achieve within the community now. And some of that is this, range of densities for housing that it's not necessarily rental apartments that are, 3-story buildings all over the place. It's, the opportunity to build smaller units that maybe from the outside don't look like it's that many. And I'll give you a small example that we have, like the Werglin house downtown next to El Toro Bravo. It's that blue house that has 13 units in it. And most people would never even think about that because it looks like an old historic house. And a lot of communities have been much more successful about breaking up their density and creating the image that the community has, maintaining their authenticity and character, but integrating that density in a way that really does embrace who they are. And so that's the type of opportunity that we hoped was coming through in the options that were presented. And I know that that was a big point for GPAC in kind of looking at, where do we accommodate what's missing within the community? So that's part of the mindset in creating these. And then we get into our alternative D, which is about infill development. So again, higher density housing, a lot of development kind of along corridors. This would include policy options for the former Canyon Springs site to preserve that as open space. So it really depends, again, on where the community's interests lie. But for you as a commission, as you're looking through this on your own, use these as your tools. And then we have our alternative E for low growth. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. I feel like it's not the same as the current general plan, but is a lower intensity of overall development than any of the other alternatives that we've shown. Still allowing for some mixed use, and then recognizing riverfront mixed use option versus industrial, but again, not at the same level of intensity and density as some of the other options. And then we have this on here as a specific question within the workshops talking about our industrial land, again, because it's such a huge factor within the West River focus area, but it's also our need, as we change as a community and we have new needs, our current industrial businesses are struggling to find spaces that they fit in. So it's, for some businesses, prohibiting their ability to grow, to add more employees, to change, or for other businesses to establish. So there's some areas where there's less competition because of that. And so this is one of those trade-off discussions of, if we're gonna require that we relocate businesses off the river and we want to meet our future demand, do we need to look at other additional sites for industrial? And we did propose some options, including redesignating open space within Jorger, and then some of the land that the airport owns. And I can tell you right now that most of the feedback we got from the workshops was definitely no way would you change the open space within the Jorger Ranch specific plan. But we didn't know until we asked the question. And then we have our alternative F for river revitalization. So this alternative would envision the West River area as mixed use with business innovation district for housing and employment. So it kind of shows those differences. And then what we did in the last presentation too was kind of go into the comparison so you can look at it more at that metrics level. And I know this is a lot of information, which is why we have the briefing book and why we printed hard copies. So as community members, if you're interested in a hard copy, you can pick them up at Town Hall. We also have them at different locations in the community. So for example, Word After Word Books, we have them at Mountain Home Center. We also printed out the survey in a questionnaire format in case someone wanted to handwrite that in. And so we haven't gone out and collected those yet, but there should be some of those coming into us. So we're really trying to get this information out in a variety of ways to be able to speak to the community and what works for them. So whether it's online, whether it's in person, whether it's in paper, whether we're just trying to do as much as we can to ensure that people know about this process and participate in this process. So sorry for a lot of text on here, but it is very useful in kind of looking at those comparisons. So for build out, this shows the total capacity numbers for all of the alternatives that we have. And this number represents the new net capacity of the amount of development that we could potentially have under each alternative. So again, I mentioned this before, it's not necessarily what actually is going to get built, but these are ways for us to look at those kind of numbers when we're talking about density and intensity. Another metric that we were kind of looking at when we were talking about what's appropriate for Truckee if we're going to change anything is vehicle miles traveled. And that's not something that we talk about in the 2025 general plan. Everything was based on kind of the community level of service. Traffic has and always will be probably a concern for many community members. We were very strong in the 2025 general plan about how many lanes we were going to create in the community, not having a bypass that was 4 lanes, pushing back against Caltrans when they said that that's what they wanted, not doing a bunch of stoplights, focusing on roundabouts. So I think it's been just part of Truckee's DNA to always look at these other options that were alternatives to kind of single car travel. This is the opportunity to take that to the next level with this general plan. And part of that is talking about, where we're coming from, where we're going to, and what that looks like. So it can get very technical, I will say, and a lot of it's based on modeling, but fundamentally, if you're building housing closer to services, you're going to have less vehicle miles traveled. And so that's just something to think about as we go through this process of if we're dispersing development or we're not willing to change and look at different types of intensity of development near services, then we won't really have a lot of influence. Equally, if we're not looking at what our housing opportunities are, we could potentially still have people and more people commuting from outside of the area because we can't accommodate our workforce here. And so it's not just within the town limits, it's broader than that. It's, what attracts people here, it's where people live, it's where they work, and it's how we function together as a community. So it's a very important topic and something that GPAC was, kind of focused on, particularly in looking at ways that whatever alternative we adopt really does minimize sort of the cars, the emphasis, whether it's parking, how we're doing our streetscapes, whatever it is, that we're really trying to get away from our old development patterns. I think if Chelsea were sitting in my seat right now, she would want to emphasize that a lot of times with these modeling exercises that they create an over-projection. And so some of the numbers that you can see in this, may seem high, or gee, if we want to reduce our VMT numbers by X% in this next general plan, we're probably going to have to drill down a little bit more and figure out, based on these alternatives that we have, is that achievable and how do we do that? But I think it's just good to understand starting out that that is something that we were looking at and cognizant of, particularly if we're talking about having an impact with climate change. We included in the briefing book too, kind of this high level comparison of how transit supportive each of the alternatives would be. So let's get to that one. So this was just kind of a high level overview of what that would look like. It looked at bus services. It looked at kind of our opportunities for if we were going to have housing next to jobs, what that looks like. So that was, metrics someone could use in kind of walking through these different alternatives to determine, if that's an important issue for you, then this would be a graphic for you to be able to go through and make that decision. And then also greenhouse gas emissions. So alternative A has the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. where E and F have the highest greenhouse gas emissions. And the variation in emissions between the alternatives is really, again, based on the land use mix that ultimately we decide we either want to change or don't want to change. And then in relation to the location of those land uses within the community. And, as I said, the traffic model, is based on development capacity that would likely not occur until, well after the 2040 general plan is stale. And it doesn't consider changes in mode shift or number of people biking or walking versus driving. But I think, again, it's still something that the community has interest in considering, and council's already made some very strong goals about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The total difference between the lowest emissions scenario, so that's the current general plan, and the highest, is about 6,200 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is about the same as the emissions produced from 1,300 cars driven for 1 year. So that's just kind of a point of reference. These estimates that are shown don't include measures that would further reduce emissions from new growth as part of the town's climate action plan or from policies included in the general plan. So we will get there. The community has asked to have those discussions. You have to create some sense of what your land use alternatives are first before you can plug that back into what kind of policies you're going to create, and then ultimately what your greenhouse gas emissions would be from that land use alternative that you build. So a lot of moving parts, things that are working together, but just know that those are things that will be coming, the policy discussion, and ultimately if we're going to look at creating some sort of reduction thresholds or things like that. Just more numbers for that. Okay, this is the new stuff. Hopefully you're not tired of me talking yet. So Jen and I were working with Ascent this morning, and they were able to, in a short amount of time, pull together all of the summaries that we had done from the mural boards with the virtual workshops, the in-person sticky notes, your dots that you had posted in the in-person, and then also the 465 responses that we got from the online survey. So again, it's not everything because we still have some questionnaires and things that are out there, but it's at least sort of what we're calling right now emerging concepts. And there was a lot of support for mixed use low in Donner Lake. That was probably one of the only focus areas that had the majority of the responses kind of in concurrence. For the Gateway area, more people supported options 2 and 3, so that mixed use low to medium. But traffic concerns were something that were kind of commonly talked about through all of that. And really what this is allowing us to do is to take sort of this information and give it to GPAC at their next meeting, so that we're taking what, some of these had multiple options, it's paring them down even further based on this feedback, so that when GPAC's looking at making their recommendation to the Planning Commission, that they've already taken into consideration that feedback and are really focusing on sort of the critical options that are left based on that feedback. For 89 North, as I mentioned before, there wasn't clear consensus on housing densities, and so that's going to be a question for GPAC to identify what they think an appropriate range would be. But a lot of people supported using the designation for Pioneer Commerce Center, and just general support for housing and public facility. Still some concern about loss of industrial land, and I think that's just based on the legacy of how the area is built out as much as anything. For West River Street, now I put on here no clear consensus, more support for option 4, and we did just talk about that one today. So the Riverfront Mixed-Use one, after having gotten all the rest of the data that we got this afternoon, was the clear front runner. Like it was 38%, I think, of the votes, and then everything else was like substantially less. So that one pretty much was the one that the community kind of weighed in on and said, yeah, we think that would be an option we'd like to consider. We still had a lot of comments coming in about industrial heritage that we have as a community, and kind of where our industrial use is going to go. So I think that's that trade-off question that we haven't resolved yet, but it's still in the background for us to discuss. And then there were people who wanted to emphasize that maybe it's a split the difference of looking at industrial on the north side and then more of this riverfront mixed use on the south side of West River. And so when the GPAC gets to look at this, they'll probably have some of these, emerging concepts shown as different options. So new and exciting. And then for Glenshire, strong support for what I'm calling, a new option 4, whatever option we want to call it, 100% open space with recognition of landowner compensation. And a lot of feedback that, if we had to commit to building houses there, really they should be for full-time residents. And then equally looking at kind of a option 2, option 3 hybrid, that if open space isn't feasible, then it's probably not the best option to resort back to the current general plan, but to take that step of looking at this as a planning opportunity site. And then most of the feedback we got about the neighborhood center was supported, so changing that. I think the one caveat to that is, better understanding if that would actually create new opportunities for people to do mixed use out there, or if there's really interest in more businesses relocating out in that area. The question about industrial land, and I mentioned this before, strong opposition to designating the open space in Jorger. But then some other ideas that came out, one of them we had already presented, which was looking at industrial on the airport land, but looking at airport flats. So this is sort of when you're leaving town on the freeway, and it's kind of opposite of where the ag station is, that big open area called airport flats, which is currently as open space. So, is that where we should put it, or do we move it out of town? Just different things that people were thinking about as they were responding. And then Jen and I put together this slide because we thought it would be helpful to just recognize more big picture about some of the more general feedback themes that we've gotten as we started this general plan update process. I will say it's not everything. So if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I raised my idea and it's not on here, it's not going to be comprehensive. But I think this just gives you a snapshot of some of the things that the community is thinking about. And growth is a definite concern. We've heard from multiple people, it's great you showed all these options, but we want something that's less than the 2025 general plan. That isn't an option that's shown. It doesn't mean it can't be discussed, but it's going to be focused to our non-residential development. So I think that's just something that, seeing additional community members here, kind of feeling additional traffic, it's the question of, why are we growing? Do we need to grow? What does that look like? Is that an option that we need to put on the table? And then focusing on housing, concern about if we, increase densities, wherever in town because of state density bonus law, what's the guarantee that these housing units would be for full-time residents? And so it seems like there's a lot of support for density in certain parts of the community, but tied to some connection of affordability or workforce requirement or something like that. So it wasn't just we want to, increase our total population numbers. It's we want to find a solution to issues that we already have in the community so that we can help our current community members and future community members that really need to be part of our workforce. And then this is more specific to kind of the MacGyver former Canyon Springs site is how do we transfer housing densities? If we as a community say that a site is no longer appropriate for housing, but the state has been very clear that if you have housing densities allocated, how do we change that? And so that's kind of some of the options we presented of, looking at a policy to do that. So whether it's the future transfer development rights or something else, it could be something that we look at. It's not a land use designation, right? So you kind of have to work with the policies and the land use designations together to look at that. We were talking about that with Ascent earlier today, and that work would have to be in conjunction with looking at our housing element, because we have planned for, very specific sites based on our housing needs allocation. And so if the community says, we want to create that program, let's put that in the general plan as a more solid program than what we have in our current 2025 general plan, we're going to have to go to that effort of projecting out our next housing element cycle and whether or not we're going to be deficient, if we're going to get other areas of the community that need to be upzoned that we didn't anticipate, or if we actually have land to accommodate these other numbers. So it's just something that we would have to do through that policy work. But I want to recognize that we've heard that, repeatedly from different community members. Also, cars are not the priority, and I simplified it here, but it really is about, we as a community are here because of our environment, our quality of life, and if we're constantly taking that same approach that we've had for the last, several years, like we're just going to keep building, the same development pattern. Like we're going to miss that opportunity to provide, the bike paths, to encourage people to get out and limit the number of trips that they're making by car. It's sort of a healthy lifestyle choice that the community's kind of asked for us to look at. And then we lumped on here continuing concerns, because these are all equally important, and these are things that, yes, we're looking at through the land use alternatives, but also through the rest of the general plan update process. Traffic, evacuation, wildfire, community character, that's been a big one lately. Climate change, river revitalization, over-tourism, lack of industrial space. Again, this is not everything. This is just sort of that big picture, like here are a lot of the things that keep coming up as part of these discussions, so that we have those on our radar as we're looking at these concepts, as we're looking at what sort of preferred land use alternative we want to move forward with the general plan update process. I promise I'm almost done. I only have a couple more slides. So for next steps, the General Plan Advisory Committee is going to have one of their regular meetings, and this is going to be a beefy one for them because they're going to have a lot of information to go through to make some recommendations to the Planning Commission about what the preferred land use alternative should be, and that could come out in a variety of ways. We're talking about, I didn't change this. I put on this slide September for Planning Commission, but it's likely more October, and then Council would be in November. And it's tentative because, we're still working through the process, but that was sort of the timeline that we had projected. This is my last slide, and we decided to put this one at the end, really to kind of reinforce all the information that we had presented to you, that this isn't a decision-making night. It was really an opportunity for you to hear some of that detailed information that we had been talking about in the community, get you up to speed, allow you to ask questions, opportunity for public comment, and then really prepare yourself for what's coming. So with that, I'm done. Jen and I are both available to answer questions to our best ability. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Danielle. That was extensive. Okay, so now we move into questions and answers from the Planning Commission. I'm going to look down here. Daniel, do you have any questions?
I sure do. Thank you, Danielle. That was a lot of information that I was reading that, so you did a wonderful job kind of presenting that. Kind of from a high level, it sounds like this is a big menu and we can kind of pick and choose whatever we want and play with it. So you could have an option 2.5 or 2.4, and that would kind of, for any focused area, right?
Right, yeah. This was just a way for us to frame the information, but definitely the pick and choose option is out there.
And what is, so the GPAC committee is going to present kind of their recommendation, and then it'll be up to us as the Planning Commission to say, yes, looks good, or make our own changes?
So you will want to take that into consideration along with the staff's recommendation, the public feedback that's been provided, and then you would formulate a commission recommendation that goes to council. Council will get both GPAC's and the Planning Commission's specific recommendations to consider. So if you like what you see from GPAC, you would say, oh, we support this, or if you disagree, you would identify areas that you disagree.
And the decision will be kind of, GPAC's decision will be kind of presented the way you just presented here with each of the different focus areas.
Yeah, I mean, we have not gotten to that specificity yet, but I think just to make it easier, showing it at both the focus level and the townwide level is going to be the best way to show it, since that's how we've been presenting it.
And is it possible to build in the ability to make a change for kind of an unforeseen situation or project or proposal down the line? Kind of like almost some of the stuff we've seen with Yoga Ranch that now is falling under decisions that were made years ago.
I mean, you always have the option to amend your general plan. So a lot of communities just don't do it because it's, an extensive process to get the community to participate, but you can change it at any time, and you can change all of the elements or only portions or whatever you want. So it probably would depend on the circumstances that, you could have a policy, for example, that says, revisit specific plans, every so often, and decide if any amendments, should be considered through a public process or something like that. You can make it very generic and broad or specific depending on what you're looking at.
But if we said the gateway area was going to be the low mixed-use area, which I love this terminology, it's nice and easy to actually digest, but then someone brought a great project aboard that said, hey, this is actually a 4-story building in what we're saying is a max 2 to 3-story range, but this is a deed-restricted, locals, affordable, and kind of checked a lot of boxes, would we be able to say we like that, or that does not meet the general plan, and so that really doesn't work?
If it didn't meet the general plan, then we would amend it, yeah.
We would either amend the plan or have to not do the project.
Right.
And what's the general plan amendment process look like?
Well, it's an application, so it can either be triggered by the council directing staff to do it, or, so for example, they said, oh, this is for affordability, we got a request from a property owner to make this a priority for staff. They could tell us to do it and not charge an applicant, or an applicant could come in and pay the $6,500 deposit?
$8,500 deposit.
Yeah, and then work through the process with the planning department, which would then go to the planning commission for a recommendation and then council for a decision. They're not typically very fast, I will say, though. A lot of them take a year or more, even if it seems like it's a good project.
And would you call that rezoning, basically?
Yeah. Rezoning, and or it could be modifying a land use designation. So they have to be consistent with both, so it would depend on what they're proposing.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm confused, though. Couldn't they just use like the density bonus process to actually get that project approved? You cannot deny it if it fits in the density bonus, if it's 100% affordable.
Yeah, you could. That's why it really depends on the specifics of what they're talking about. If they wanted to do the project, add density bonus, and then still wanted more units above that, then that's where the conflict would happen. But that is a question community members have asked about density bonuses. We show these density numbers for housing, and those don't include density bonus. Doesn't include ADUs. So there's other things that, add to our sort of density and intensity that aren't reflected.
And then there was that comment on one of the last slides. It said Truckee is growing enough. Let's stop the growth. Is that actually really possible?
Go ahead, Jenna. Let me stop talking for a minute. Sure.
Great question. And Danielle and I strategized earlier. I think I get to be the Debbie Downer a little bit. I've been calling myself that a lot lately. We really can't. The decision of whether or not we want to grow has essentially been taken out of our hands by the state of California and the legislature and the laws that have been, put into law over the past several years. So from a residential standpoint, we really cannot change or reduce our existing densities. What we can do is shift them around a little bit, but we can't reduce them. And that law is in effect for another 4 years. And we obviously don't know what will happen after 2025. What we can control is our commercial, our institutional, our industrial square footage, and we may be able to reduce that. However, one of our concerns, and Danielle and I keep beating this drum, is if we are growing, which the state of California is essentially saying we must do, with some limited exceptions for very high fire areas, we still think it's important to accommodate both industrial, institutional, and commercial uses, in particular because of the concern that if we don't have them here, people will continue to go down to Reno and the other side of the hill to get those services. And so therefore, we're not achieving some of our other objectives related to reducing VMT and greenhouse gas and whatnot. So that is a very difficult question to answer, but the short answer is we really have no control over it at this point.
When would this general plan update go into effect?
Well, after it's adopted, so, we originally were projecting June 2022. I think we're going to end up pushing that out a little bit longer. So it'd probably be closer to fall of 2022 at this point.
But certainly by the end of next year, call it, at the latest.
That's the goal.
So when would the next update be? Is that going to, in a couple years before 2040?
Honestly, if we do achieve that goal of doing it by the end of 2022, we'll have been in about a 5-year process. So realistically, you'd want to add another 10 years on to when that final adoption date is before you even talk about changing it.
So 15 years at a minimum.
Yeah, I would say
Yeah.
15 to 20, depending on how well the 2040 general plan holds up.
And again, I would say, if there's something that changes in the community drastically during that time frame, like there is still the option to go in and amend things. Our housing element's on a different cycle, but even so, if, all of a sudden we realized that, we don't have any water, that's a totally different circumstance. And so those are things that would influence your decision to amend your plan sooner.
And are you going to be here to spearhead the 2055 update? You don't have to answer that.
I can't answer that.
That's it.
Thank you. And Ms. Miller, are you ready?
Thank you. Could someone talk about which of the 3 possible industrial areas was the most favored through the feedback and why? We had the option to vote on each of them individually, but as you commented, it was hard to convey a trade-off about industrial specifically.
Oh, you mean it's sort of if we were going to move it off the river, where would it go?
Or just, where's the town's favorite place for industrial?
We probably didn't even get to that level of kind of questioning with these alternatives. I think we were just trying to understand the trade-offs between what we have now and need. So that will be an important question for us to answer. Sure, in a perfect world, it wouldn't be on the river, and in a perfect world, we wouldn't be using open space to, transition to more industrial. We originally thought it could go out at Jorger, and so we did plan for some of that. That's the Truckee Tall lumber site. We still have other land out there that's zoned for that. Putting things around the airport logically makes sense, and so that's why we showed that kind of airport area as another opportunity.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the process of the Planning Commission and policies? Is this something where we'll respond to staff proposals, we get to introduce our own? How does that work?
It's everything. We'll be presenting drafts of things to GPAC and then the Planning Commission, and GPAC's going to modify, change, add, and those will be shown, and then the Planning Commission will do the same. So we'll do our best to capture what we've heard through the public process, correct the things that we know need to be corrected just from our time here and working with the general plan, and identify those emerging community interests. But we're not going to catch everything, so we really need those eyes on it. And part of the concept with the GPAC meeting, too, is to use, I forget what we called it, Conveo maybe was the program where basically all the GPAC members can go in and kind of add their notes and comments, and everyone can see them at the same time to kind of understand where everyone's interests are in changing the policies.
Sounds like fun. I have a handful more. So I like the framing at the beginning. I've seen this a few times, and it was nice to go through it all at once. And the goals strike me as being a little thin, but the big ideas are really good, and I like them. I think they are exciting, but they dictate, in my interpretation, maybe that's how it works, they dictate pretty clear directions for these. Do you have any advice on how we should be balancing the big ideas that we all conceptually agree to with our feelings about each alternative and with the survey about each alternative, or the surveys and their results on the alternatives? If we think one could accomplish one of these big ideas better, should that override the survey?
It's an interesting question because we're not decision makers, so we don't grapple with that at the same level that you do as decision makers. And I think it's, looking at it from a balance perspective of, we have these goals, we have sort of these big ideas, we have these, level of feedback from the community, and we have to mash them all together. And then there's 5 of you kind of talking that through. So I think it's important to look at them all, and then, based on the goals of a general plan update, coming up with your recommendations.
Sounds like fun. I'm curious if you happen to know, or if this is something that could come up at the next GPAC meeting, research about demand for specific housing types. I remember from 10 plus years ago in grad school reading something about how if Los Angeles never built another single family home, they'd be fine. They overbuilt their supply. Obviously, that's very different than here. I feel personally like any size of housing that you build, someone would buy. And I haven't been able to find research that I feel is applicable to Truckee. And I'm curious if that's like housing, not for existing people, because we obviously moved here for the existing housing supply, but if there's some way to balance those future interests.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a specific study other than, Mountain Housing Council has done, their own kind of needs assessment of, what the community should be looking at for our future housing needs. And then we've done like a survey at the town. I know the PUD and the hospital have also kind of, identified with our staff, like what kind of housing needs they have. And I think the challenge is that a lot of people fundamentally want a single family or think they want a single family. And we just can't keep building at that level. And so if you give them another alternative of like, well, you could rent this single family maybe and compete with other people, or you could buy an attached townhome in, a smaller square footage footprint. I mean, the market will demand some of that. And so right now it's just, we don't ultimately know what that demand is. And so we have to kind of program the opportunities for that variety and flexibility, which is something that our current general plan is kind of constrained on. And I know that the numbers look scary for some community members and gee, it's growth, it's growth, it's growth. Well, we really have to get additional density to house people and provide those other housing types.
Yeah, I really appreciated how throughout the general plan discussions, there's been a lot of talk about senior housing. In my family, we're actively trying to transition a few older members into housing, and senior housing sounds great, but this one mother-in-law in particular doesn't want to live around only old people. And I totally understand that. That makes a lot of sense. And it is hard to do affordable by design. Like that clearly doesn't work, but you actually can do senior by design. You can require ground level be a certain size. I did a senior design school, again, in grad school forever ago, but those are things that anyone would want to live in. Like I want to live someplace walkable personally. So I'm optimistic that some of that density can check off other boxes that we're trying to do, and we can use policies and all that. That's not a question, I apologize. What's happening outside the focus areas?
I mean, they would be consistent with what's in the current general plan, unless there's, substantial feedback that you get as a commission or that the council gets about exploring other areas at this point.
So they're zoned for some amount of growth, but not.
Right. I mean, we have, single family areas where there's vacant lots. So the assumption is those would eventually be built on. We have vacant commercial in Tahoe Donner, for example, that, wasn't shown on here, but it's under the current general plan. And so if there's other areas that the community wants us to talk about, those are things they could provide feedback on and then provide that to you.
Got it. I know there's a lot going on, and I don't want to backseat community build, but has anyone had a chance to talk with the TRPA about transferable development rights? Because they're doing it down the street. It's not foreign to the basin.
Yeah, I mean, we've not spent substantial time with them or aware of their program.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. Moving away from housing for a second, can you talk through just generally how the mobility portion will be prepared, what that process might look like?
So, I mean, we have a whole entire element, which currently in our general plan is our circulation element. We're retitling it to mobility. We have an administrative draft of that written. And so that, along with the climate action element, would be the first two that the GPAC gets to talk about.
And those are also informed by the same goals and big ideas.
Yep.
Excellent. Does the town have an opinion? Again, my attempt to research things on my phone during meetings. Does the town have an opinion on minimum density of either residential or employment to support reliable transit?
I mean, that's something that's not in the current general plan. And so that's something that we could talk about, when we get into that kind of discussion of which land use option we want to do and then the policies that support that. So I know that there's been, we kind of have it in some ways in our current general plan that if you don't provide, sort of the density allotted for that area, that you get a requirement for more affordable housing. But it's probably not at this same scale that you're talking about.
Yeah, I found myself struggling with some plans, some options that were, it's denser. Is it dense enough? I'd rather, again, speaking personally, I'd rather do no density where there's no chance of transit and enough density to support transit. And just knowing an official number would be helpful there. Again, apologies, not a question. Last one, which of the alternatives has the best opportunity to support regional transit? So people that either work here but don't live here, or vice versa?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would want to run that past our transit staff member because they're going to have a much better sense of how our routes are operating and where the highest demand is at what location. But my sense is that you would want to put your density around areas where you know that that's going to be a successful route and have the higher ability to turn over the turnaround times for the waits for the buses and the transit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I said that was my last one, but this one actually is, does the mobility section consider routes that don't exist today? I'm thinking like Reno shuttles.
That would probably, I can't remember what we had in there, but it's probably at the policy level of, explore other options.
Okay.
Kind of thing.
So by 2045, we're not going to do more than explore.
Well, I mean, that's a question for you as decision makers to talk about. We may identify something as a policy of explore, and then you may say, nope, that needs an action item that says by such and such date, you need to blah, blah, blah. So,
Roger that. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I, as always, have a ton of questions. So I have already spoken with Danielle today. Hopefully she's all set for them then. But I have a little section here of questions just generated from the conversation already. So let's see. My first one is, it sounded to me like you said earlier that we do not have an element for the climate action plan, and then it sounded like you said we did.
The 2025 general plan does not have a climate action element, and we as a town do not have a climate action plan currently. But because that's a priority, the council had decided with the general plan update process to combine what was originally two separate capital improvement projects, the general plan update and creating a climate action plan, into one process, and that turned into an element for the general plan, which we right now have in an administrative draft.
Okay, so there is an element. It is still in its administrative draft, and it's still coming to us because we've had that administrative draft for a year or two now, haven't we?
It's been a while, yeah.
Okay. So on page 3 of that briefing book, there's that little timeline thing, and it makes it look like once we decide this. This land use alternative right here, Planning Commission and Town Council select preferred alternative, summer 2021. It has an arrow going right into preferred townwide alternative equals the general plan. But then, since then, you have sort of said, no, we still have other chapters to go. So that mobility chapter.
Yeah, that's just the map. So, Ascent kind of put it on there as, that is the foundation of the 2040 general plan, but we still have all the elements, the environmental review process, the adoption process, just like that slide that I showed.
What elements are complete?
Well, we just have administrative drafts. So we've done audits for all of the elements. We have our outline of all the new elements that we're doing.
I mean, none are complete.
Yeah.
They are in varying stages of partial completeness.
Well, housing is complete, is it not?
Oh,
that's the only one.
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I meant of the ones that are not complete that are part of this update. They vary.
Okay, so housing is complete, then we will be on land use, then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 more elements, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean,
Something like
there's
that.
a variety, yeah. So the moving forward, once GPAC's done with their recommendation for the preferred land use alternative, then they will be looking at the elements. And then ultimately their recommendations for those will move forward to you. So the first time you'll see them is after GPAC's looked at them and made the recommendations.
I will probably be sitting in the GPAC meetings as well. But so how do we have an administrative draft of the mobility if the GPAC hasn't seen it at all?
Administrative drafts are staff drafts. So we always start with staff drafts of anytime we do document changes. So that's where we've gone through and identified things that are stale and need to be removed, or things we've accomplished and no longer relevant. It's the emerging ideas that we've gotten out of earlier public feedback. It's a variety of things. It's changes in state law. So we do the bones of that first. so that there's something to talk about when you take it to whether it's GPAC or Planning Commission.
Excellent, thank you. That's a perfect answer. And then you talked about bringing it to your transit staff member. Do we have that staff member yet?
We do, and I apologize, I cannot remember his name.
No worries, excellent. I would love to meet them. So then you also talked about this paper questionnaire. So that is still available for people who have missed the online survey. They can still fill that out and get that to you, drop it here at Town Hall.
They can. I will say we're about to go start picking them up. So if you do have one of those out there, please try your best to get that to us this week so that we can include that in the information that we're releasing to GPAC.
Okay, and you're saying you're picking them up from where?
From the different sites that we set them off at. Carissa, can you relist those for us?
Yes, we dropped off both briefing books and paper surveys at Word After Word, at Mountain Home Center, and at the Lyft co-working space.
Okay, so someone still has a couple of days if they want to pick up one of those and fill it out this week.
Right, and we also gave them out at the farmers market.
Super, thank you. Okay, I'm going to dive into some more specific questions here. If we go to focus area 4, which is the West River Street, how do all of those options affect that possibility of that co-housing site? Does any of them eliminate that or make that impossible?
I can answer that question just because this was my station. Options 1 and 2 would make the co-housing proposal more difficult. Options 3 could work, maybe not, depends on where we go with that. Option 4 would definitely work, and option 5 would work as well. And in particular, if there was not a split zone separating kind of the co-housing property, that would certainly help facilitate their project.
Because currently it's on 2 different zoned properties.
Yeah, they've got some split zone and parcel configuration challenges that they're trying to work through.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I will say I'm a little concerned that how the survey data will be used when we're coming up with a clear winner has 38% of the votes. I mean, I understand there's a lot of splits, but that's not really a question, just a comment. Moving on. Oh, that one was already. And, I'm sorry, Jenna, you said that there are exceptions for putting housing in very high fire areas, but when we look at this map on page, wherever it is, 15, almost all of the town is very high fire areas. What are those exceptions?
SB 330 has an exemption in high fire hazards. And there are some bills that are, I guess, creeping their way through the legislation that may change some of the requirements in very high fire hazard areas.
So SB 330 is already passed, correct?
Yes, that's currently in place.
And what does it say? Just if you're in a high or very high?
I think it's very high fire sorry, a little sleep deprived, high fire hazard area, then certain aspects of SB 330 don't apply.
Oh, interesting. That's the first we've heard of that. Okay. Okay, now I'm moving on to this. So again, if I'm staying on that map on page 15 with the fire zones on there, and it's hard to tell, but can you bring that up? Is that too hard?
We don't have internet.
Okay. Okay. So, and this is sort of personal concern, but it looks like much of Sierra Meadows to the west of the airport there is not in a very high zone. Is that correct? Am I reading that? It's hard to tell where Sierra Meadows is when there's no roads. It's either high or moderate instead of very high. I see you guys squinting very closely at your maps.
Yeah, I think you're right when you look at this map. I mean, obviously in the general plan, we would have a much bigger map for this so that you could, get down to that very specific level. But it does look like based on this mapping that it's in not the same very high or high zone. Like, it looks like part of it's moderate to high.
But it also looks like where Yorga Ranch is in that very high. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure how accurate that is because we went through that exercise recently on a pre-application for SB 330. And I believe that they are not classified as very high fire.
Yorga Ranch is not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. On the same page, on page 15, it talks a lot about our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We've talked about that before and been told that it's not codified yet. How do we get that codified in our new general plan?
So that would be something that would be looked at with the climate action element. So you could have very specific requirements in there, whether it's at a project level, townwide level, whatever it is.
And is that in the administrative draft already?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but we could look at that.
I would love to follow up on that. Thank you. So I'm going to skip now up to pages 20 and 21. This is the existing general plan land use designations and then the proposed ones. So currently in our residential, our very undense residential, the 0.5 to 1 dwelling unit per acre down to the 3 to 6. It says neighborhood serving commercial uses is in the description there. It's not in the description when we move over to rural residential or any of the other ones. Does that get taken out?
I mean, that's something for us to discuss. So, right now, this is just reflecting what's in the current 2025 general plan. And I think when Ascent was looking at redescribing these, they were focusing on the residential. So it would be a combination of how we describe that in the 2040 general plan along with the zoning that goes with it. But I mean, I think as of right now, if we didn't change the zoning, you would still be able to do those types of uses.
Okay. And then as we're trying to move towards denser housing, is there ever a possibility to eliminate this very low density residential?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we had talked about with Senate Bill 9, which is working its way through the legislation, which is at that level of reassessing our single family zoning and allowing for the townhome ADU, junior ADU option. So it is something that could be revisited.
But it's not something that it's within the town's powers to eliminate very low density housing land use designations.
No, we could. I mean, if you're basically upzoning it, so you could, yes. So you could say no more single family land use designations, whether they're identified on here as residential 0.5 dwelling units an acre, or even if we call it cluster, whatever it is, you could say, nope, we don't like that. We want them all to be medium density.
But you couldn't go the other way and say, this is too not dense out here. We want this to be open space. We want to move that building property right to somewhere else or something.
That's the challenge. That's the sort of other policy that we've been talking about.
All right, thank you. So then I'm skipping down to mixed use, the mixed use designation in the new one. It's low, medium, and high. So it's set up, the description is multifamily residential, retail, office, and service commercial. But how do you require, can you require mixed use in here, or you can just allow it?
I know we laugh. Do you want to, I answered this one earlier, but I think, it's worth having Jenna's kind of flavor on it too.
Yeah, it's something we've actually asked Ascent, that it would need to be explicit that mixed use is the expectation, and that there would be policy language or development standard that would stipulate how that mixed use would work, whether that's a ratio or a percentage or some other standard that would get you a true mixed use rather than just a standalone residential project.
I think what we're not clear on yet with HCD is whether or not someone came in and said, well, you allow for 12 to 18 dwelling units per an acre. I just want to do standalone residential because that's what's financially feasible. I can't afford to do mixed use. Would the state then say you have to allow for that project, even if your land use designation has a requirement for a percentage of non-residential to be built concurrent with that residential? So that's something we're still working on an answer to.
Okay, it's weird and scary to be voting on land use designations that we don't know what they would look like, and we may not have control over how they come out. Okay.
Yes,
Excellent.
we concur.
Thank you. Okay, and is SB9 looking likely? Anyone?
I mean, it's moving further along than we thought. We thought it would get stalled out more. And there's been a lot of opposition, particularly from like the League of California Cities. And a lot of cities have submitted their own letters of opposition, including the town and the configuration that it's in. It's not that fundamentally the town is opposed to reassessing single family. It's just the way that it's structured in this early wording has some things that wouldn't work with our snow requirements, like snow storage or setbacks, things like that. And so with refinement, we probably could get behind it, but right now we've kind of joined the other cities that say you should reassess these things.
Was that a town council recommendation to send a letter?
I'm pretty sure we took that to council, yeah.
Interesting, thank you. Earlier we talked about 85% of our housing stock is for single-family residential, and Danielle, you weren't sure if it was 85% of our land use designation.
It's the units, yeah, not the designations. So I know Ascent has those numbers of what our designation breakdown is. I just couldn't pull it up before this meeting. So that's something that we'll provide you with your next review.
Great, no worries on that, thank you. Okay, so I'm going on to the next page, 21. We're into industrial now. So currently in our industrial land use designation, you can have what percentage is for an accessory or a retail use?
So it's 25%.
Okay, and then does that change when you go to business innovation?
It could.
Could. Yeah.
Business innovation only exists in one place currently, and that's in the Georgia Ranch specific plan. And gosh, I don't know that standard, but it could vary. I think we have the ability to create that designation as we see fit. It doesn't have to mimic what's currently in the Georgia Ranch specific plan.
Yeah, and I mean, that would be, we'd have to create a whole new zone in the development code, because we don't have that now. We should have done it with the Georgia Ranch specific plan and kind of loosely just said, well, it's specific plan. So we can clean that up, and then within that we can create whatever development standards we want.
Okay, so the main difference between the industrial and the business innovation is a higher floor area ratio and a higher number of standalone residential units?
Well, so as I mentioned earlier, in our current industrial land use designation, we don't actually identify a density for housing. And I think in part because we just assumed most people at the time we did the 2025 general plan wouldn't be integrating housing with industrial. That was something that evolved after we had adopted that general plan. And so the planning staff kind of looked at what's, similar with other land use designations to come up with opportunities for people to provide housing. This would be in business innovation, the ability for us to specify. And I think what's not clear in the development standards listed here is if you're going to do housing on top of industrial, should that be 4 dwelling units per acre, or if the whole site, they specify here if the whole site is residential, then yeah, that's 12, but there's some ambiguity in here that we should clean up. I think for the public, the biggest thing to recognize the differences is that true industrial has a lot of pretty heavily intensive uses that have outdoor storage, outdoor activities that associate with that. So think more of like a tow business, where they're towing vehicles, or an auto repair business versus the coffee roaster where most of their activity is happening inside. They still need warehouse space and they're still making something at a manufacturing level, but they don't need that same outdoor activity. They don't have the same employee demands. There's still a customer interface that you don't often get with a lot of the true industrial users.
But the take-home message on this is these are proposed new designations. So if there's something that the commission says, oh, we'd actually, we don't like 12 units per acre, we want more or less, or we don't think that FAR works. I mean, we have the ability to set these standards. These are just what's being proposed at this point.
Okay, and then, all right. Sounds good. I'm going to move on.
Can I ask a quick follow-up there?
Yes.
Would the new business innovation designation apply to the Yoga Ranch specific plan parcel?
So that's in effect right now, and it would stay. This would be, we've identified in the alternatives, I think, for Pioneer Commerce Center, and then there was portions of West River Street where we said, is that an appropriate location for it? So we kind of targeted some specific areas to look at to change the designation to that business innovation.
But the specific development standards here, the 0.5 FAR and the 12 units per acre, is that currently on that business innovation parcel?
So the land use designation for Jorger should be master plan. So we're not identifying changing that. So
The business innovation in Jorger is a zoning designation, not a land use. And it would be, if it is different, then it would apply solely to the Jorger Ranch plan.
And real quick on this, again, do we have the ability to require this to the business innovation to not be just housing, but to have some of that light commercial? Or is that similar to the same HCD question? We don't know.
same, yeah. I mean, optimistically, I'd like to say yes, but I'm sure there's a loophole somewhere that we will get feedback on from HCD.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so just a quick question about the hospital campus designation. Do we still get to determine objective design guidelines for that area?
You could. It would probably be at a future action item level, depending on the extent of what would be contemplated for that. Only in part because that's an intensive process to create a whole set of development standards for a very specific zoning district. So, but if it was like, one or two things that you wanted to include to just specify, that's probably doable.
I mean, they don't get this designation and then get to come in and say, hey, you didn't like our parking lots last time, but now we have our own designation. We can do what we want.
Well, we can structure it so they're still subject to the development code. The challenge is that the development code has design guidelines, which are not enforceable. They're recommendations, strongly suggested you should do this. They're not shalls. If you want shalls, those have to be in the general plan.
Which we are working towards, correct?
Yeah.
Town-wide.
But primarily focused on multifamily housing. The grant that we have is looking at creating objective design standards for housing,
Right,
not
but we
necessarily
also anticipate
parking.
having a future action that we list in the land use element that says, oh, and by the way, go and create these same objective design standards for non-residential uses.
But we had to do the objective design guideline standards for housing because the housing law was that you couldn't deny things on subjective standards for housing, but did that apply to commercial and or industrial as well? So we can still deny things on subjective design guidelines for commercial and industrial.
You can deny a project based on the findings.
Yes. Which include some references to design guidelines, architectural standards,
Compatibility,
et cetera.
things like that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving down, open space recreation on the former land use designation said land uses are compatible with the natural surroundings. Do we lose that in the new open space recreation designation?
Yeah, Ascent didn't carry that over, so I think if that's something that's important, then you would want to identify including that. We haven't written the descriptions for any of these modifications because we don't ultimately know if we're going to change anything, but that would be something that you would want to call out.
Great. It's just so crazy that we are voting on things that aren't defined. So The next one down is the resource conservation open space. This is where that Tykert property is, or what that Tykert property is zoned as, down by the wastewater treatment plant. Can you tell me a little bit more about why that is zoned open space and resource conservation when it is resource extraction and not open to the public?
Yeah, so, I mean, if we were to change it, for example, to something like industrial to reflect more of what's happening there, then that opens up the opportunities for anything that's classified as industrial to potentially locate in that area. And so sometimes our open space designations reflect the fact that there's not actual buildings there. Sometimes it doesn't define the quality of the open space, or whether it's active or passive, accessible to the public, not accessible to the public. So there's a lot that kind of gets wrapped under that umbrella of open space that on the surface when you look at it seems like that's a conflict, but it's really sort of that future land use.
Well, I was just going to say, it's likely a legacy designation too that's been in effect for, since maybe even the 60s, I would speculate.
Okay, well, I appreciate that input, that if we were to zone it to what's actually happening, that would open it up to more development. Great. Okay, moving on. That one we did. That one we did. Okay, so if we go into the medium density residential definitions on page 23, or sort of the description, it talks about this includes small lot single family homes, townhomes, duplexes, and apartments. So what are we picturing for a small lot single family home there? Is there a size restriction? Can we make a size restriction? Can we create a policy for that?
We can, yeah. So, I mean, right now it's very generic, and, small lot can mean different things to different people. So that is something that we would want to define. If you want a current example of what we have in the community, probably the Coldstream project that has the attached townhomes behind the Chevron. Those are attached. The lot sizes are smaller than our typical quarter acre that we have. They're probably somewhere between like 2,500.
Like 1,800 square feet.
Yeah, they're pretty small in comparison to other lot sizes in the community. So, but you could definitely come up with those standards.
And how big are the homes there?
I feel like they go up to like
They're an FAR of 1 or greater in most cases.
Yeah, I think they go up to like 2,400 square feet, and they're 2 and 3 bedroom. They're a mix.
And typically 2 or 3 stories.
Yeah.
Sorry, you said 2,400 square feet?
I think that's the highest.
I think that's a little big, but they're still in some ways as big or bigger than the lot itself in square footage.
Now, I thought we didn't apply FAR to residential. That was...
We don't. I'm just trying to help you understand the correlation between the lot size and the square footage of the homes.
Oh, and since we know the lot size is 1,800, we know the house is that or bigger. Okay, thank you. That still seems large, doesn't it? 2,400 square feet is large. That's a big house. Okay, so we briefly touched on this, the density bonus state law, where it's not been reflected in the numbers shown in the capacity for things. Can you just quickly cover again what were the conditions and requirements for density bonuses? I mean, super quick.
Do you mean what allows someone to get a density bonus?
Yes, exactly. What do they need to do in order to get a density bonus? It depends. I know that it depends somewhat on how much affordability they have.
Yeah, that's basically it. There are varying levels of density bonus that are associated with varying levels of affordability. So if someone wanted to max out their density bonus and get, 100% or 80% density bonus, they would need to do a very, very high level of affordability. If someone just wants to kind of dip their toes into the density bonus realm, they have to do the absolute bare minimum, which is what our ordinance requires, which is 15% affordability. So then that gets them up to 50% density bonus by
Yeah,
doing
I think I
that.
wrote it down. It's 15% very low to get a 50% density bonus.
So it's very low, which is 50%.
There's 3 tiers. So
Yeah, there's different, thank you.
24% for low or 44% for moderate. And any of those would get you the 50% density bonus.
All right, thank you. It's not, they still need to provide some sort of affordability component, and it's still a bit more than what our 15% inclusionary housing is.
Well, I mean, not if you include those, density bonus units, because those don't have to be, they don't have to be affordable.
Your affordability actually goes down with density bonus
Right.
because all the units that are built are market rate.
All the density bonus units
Are market rate. Yeah.
We're getting there. Just a quick discussion about floor area ratio. Wouldn't it be sort of more environmentally sound to consider site coverage instead of floor area ratio? Because floor area ratio, you can still pave almost all of it other than your landscaping requirements. Is that correct?
They're just different tools. So, I mean, even if you restricted site coverage, if you didn't also define through height or other standards, you could end up with something that is very tall that doesn't necessarily match up with the community's expectations. So, it's just another tool that we use.
All right, great.
And I think it also depends on what land use, category you're in, whether you're in a more urban area, more rural area. Those standards are sometimes more important than in other areas.
Do you want to give an example of that? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just don't know why that would make a difference. I can't picture it yet.
On Donner Lake, we have a very set FAR that is tied to creating view corridors from public vantage places of the lake. So in that case, there's a very strict FAR that might not be as important in other parts of Truckee where, public view sheds are given greater prominence.
So Jenna just gave you the one example that we have within Truckee where we do use FAR as a tool for residential, and that's for houses touching Donner Lake, like the property is on Donner Lake. So they are limited to a maximum floor area ratio.
And are they limited to, is it like 0.2? What is there?
It's based on their lot size, so it's either 40% or 50%.
40% or 50%, 50% if it's less than 10,000 square feet.
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you so much. I just couldn't picture where that would be useful. I'm on page 27 now, the Riverfront Mixed-Use New. It talks about this requires 30% of the land to be preserved as open space for scenic viewpoints and or public access. So just the first question there is that 30% of each parcel or 30% of the total area of Riverfront Mixed Use?
So it's each parcel, and then something for us to think about is if we want to define open space within that also, because right now we just say open space, but typically your landscaping counts as open space, for example.
And that's not very scenic it's not a scenic view if you're standing in somebody's landscaping around their parking lot.
Yeah, maybe not.
Okay. Yes, I'm interested in defining that open space. I'm also interested in prioritizing public access to the river instead of prioritizing scenic viewpoints of the river. I don't know if there's a way to define that, but that's a comment, not a question. Okay, we've talked about that question on the industrial. Okay, so you touched on a little bit here that the Pioneer Center industrial area sort of was downgraded from straight industrial previously. That is not necessarily happening with this redesignation. Is that correct?
So Pioneer Commerce Center is industrial for the land use designation. And then when the property owner came into the town to do a development project, he asked for approval of a plan development to modify the allowed uses. So it expanded into more commercial service, commercial type uses. And those have been where the demand is. So that's what you see out there.
Would a gym be approved in straight industrial?
Yes.
Not without the plan development that's in effect. That was a special allowance.
Well, there's nuances though, because you can do a studio.
Yes, there are some interesting pathways to gym type uses in our code. And certainly the health and fitness industry has changed pretty substantially since the early 2000s when some of our codes were put into place.
So like in Pioneer Commerce Center, that was one of the exceptions they asked for, was to be able to have a gym. And then what we've seen over time is that in other industrial areas that, kind of the studio where you have scheduled classes that you attend, those are going into industrial areas, and those are allowed.
Oh, all right. And that redesignation of that Pioneer Commerce Center, that is just a tiny corner of that big industrial area, correct? That it looks like it was not the whole area.
Well, it's not Trails End, and it's not Industrial Way.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, I'm moving on to the public land use designation on 28. So this talks about allow for student and workforce housing in conjunction with educational facilities. Would that workforce housing follow the current town definition of workforce housing, where you have to rent it out to someone who is employed nearby, or it goes to affordable housing and then you have to find somebody who is 80% AMI? Would it follow that same definition?
It's not defined yet, so the question so far was, should we consider making this modification to have it as an allowed option? But I think that's something that could be discussed. The other thing that's come out of our community input is whether or not it makes sense to just limit it to educational facilities or broaden so that we would be covering other agencies that own public facility land, in theory, so that they could house their own employees on their own land as well. So I think that's something for us to think about as we're talking through changes with the land use alternatives.
Is it possible to have some sort of affordability overlay district that equates their rent to what they are earning from that public entity?
I mean, what we've talked about with Ascent is the option to have like an affordability range, but it would be based on AMI. So if it was 100 to 200 or 80 to 120, whatever it is, having that as the restriction.
I find that slightly disappointing, having looked at current market rate rent and the school district teachers. It's 25% of the teachers, or 25% of the steps on there do not meet do not meet AMI, let alone above AMI. I feel like we're leaving the people who need it most out of that then.
I mean, we haven't defined it, so that's something for us to look at, whether or not we want to have some very specific definition. I mean, we could even define what it means to be, workforce within that specific land use designation.
Okay, I think that needs a lot of attention. Thank you for presenting that as a possibility. Okay, so now moving on to page 29, open space recreation modified. I am a little curious as to why a library is in the open space recreation instead of in public modified as a public facility.
So I think the concern here could be that we're establishing, a floor area ratio, with this open space recreation designation. This concept came out of looking at where we have parks and more of those public spaces within the community, which currently most of them are under a public facility land use designation. So I think this is something that we would have to think about because it's, pretty specific of, a library and whether or not that should have a floor area ratio cap. I mean, you could also create a policy that, specifies something different for a library too.
And why would that be easier than making that a public facility zone?
Well, I mean, libraries are not currently allowed under public facility land use designations.
Oh.
But I think we could also revisit this. I mean, these are, again, proposed descriptions of these different land use designations, and if there's something that's not making sense, we can always relook at it. I mean, if you turn back to page 28, it says under public, this designation is no longer used to identify parks and recreational facilities, and that's now been shifted over to open space. So maybe that's not right, or it needs better clarity, or even different designation language.
It was in part to recognize that there's interest in having a library in an area that's currently public facility, where this would better reflect, the variety of options that, particularly at the regional park, have been contemplated between the kids zone, museum, the library, the skate park. Yeah, so we're trying to match up kind of what we understand could be built there.
But do we want the library developed at a floor area ratio of 0.2 instead of allowing them a higher floor area ratio of?
I mean, I honestly don't know what their current plans show, so that's something that, we could look at, and if it doesn't, then you could just create a policy that's specific to give them flexibility.
Okay. Okay, and then rail transportation corridor, why is that floor area ratio so low? Is that a standard that we are keeping people to?
So this reflects what's currently out there, and this is not a change from our current general plan.
Okay, so that's just an existing condition, not a standard that is required.
Right. Mostly because we don't regulate Union Pacific, and they can do whatever they want with their property regardless of what our general plan or zoning says.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I think I'm down there. I have, okay. So moving on then back to housing a little bit. We got, when was the last time we got our RENA number requirement?
A couple of years ago, probably 2018.
I mean, we got it 8 months before we adopted the current general plan.
Which was 2019. So maybe late 2018?
Right.
Plus or minus?
And then are we on a 4-year cycle, an 8-year cycle?
8. So our current housing element is in effect until 2027 at this point.
I mean, it's interesting about that, though, because the state always has the option to drop you back to a shorter cycle if they feel like you're not working towards satisfying your housing needs that you identified in your housing element.
But we are currently on an 8-year cycle. So we would have one come in 2027 where we would probably be given a certain amount of new zoning that we needed to do. And is there an estimate for that? Is it in the hundreds? Is it in the tens? Is it in the thousands?
It's typically hundreds, high hundreds, but don't know what it'll look like in 6 years.
Okay, so within this general plan that we're doing, we're going to need to accommodate 2 or 3 RENA cycles. Is that correct? Somewhere around there?
If we stay in the state's good graces with an 8-year cycle, yes.
Okay, so that's part of that growth that we're required to do, and that's part of that growth that we're required to put into this plan. We have that for 8 years for 2027, another 8 years is 35, is that right? 2035, is that the next one?
Yeah, I mean, we will do our best, obviously, through this process, but, come that next housing element, if we are at that granular level and realize that we don't have enough land to accommodate that need, then we'll have to make modifications at that time.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand that we need to accommodate a certain amount of growth, that we haven't been given those numbers yet, but they may come in over the next 2 sets of 8 years or so. Okay. And it's in the high hundreds. That is definitely news to me. Okay. So there's that one. Okay, so part of this is hard, that we're asking people to make these decisions on this land use thing, but we're not showing how we can maintain that small town feel. Part of me feels like things that need to be addressed concurrently are issues like how do we promote walkability. I see that through trees, and how do we get people out of their cars so that we don't have that traffic? So I see a lot of hesitancy to approve more growth because we don't have adequate public transportation. Is there a possibility to change? I mean, currently we have this 10-year plan to get our bus system down to 30-minute headways, or buses running every 30 minutes. Can that be changed in this general plan update?
I mean, we can have policy language that seeks to create a more robust transit system, but the mechanics of that likely fall outside of the general plan unless there is something to the effect of, a requirement that every house or every square foot of a project contributes some amount of, money or funding toward creating that stronger operational model. But
yeah, it's almost at
tough.
a program level. So we have, a staff person whose job it is to kind of go through and look at whatever those opportunities are. They're putting together their capital improvement projects, they're working on their policy work that they present to council. And so it's not to say that we can't address something like, increase walkability. I mean, we'd have to have some parameters with that. And we could have a future action that says, explore, Commissioner Miller's favorite word, or, a standard. It's just hard when you create standards if you're not sure you can actually achieve those. So you do want to leave yourself some flexibility if you're creating new actions in your general plan, that it's something that you think is actually achievable.
I see this as like when my kids come into the kitchen and they make a snack in a big mess, and they're like, I don't have time to clean it up. And I see this density is the same way. If we don't have time to clean the kitchen, we don't have time to make that snack. If we don't have that public transportation there to help people move around without clogging the streets with traffic, we don't have the capacity for that density. Does that make sense?
I mean, it could be a chicken and egg issue. So I think it's kind of if you build the density and the demand is there, then that equally could drive the transit. Or look at it the reverse side and say, build the transit first and then people will use it. I mean, there's just different ways to look at it.
Right. You're not going to build your demand regardless if your bus only runs once an hour, is the only comment I have on that. Okay, so the last topic that I want to cover is this MacGyver, Dairy MacGyver Hill issue. And I feel like it's presented in the briefing book as it's going to be really hard to rezone that to something else. And I don't know how to say this, but this is not how it was presented to the town council when they had to rezone this. It was October 23rd. I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2017. I think it's 2017 now, since this process started in 2018. But the seated council members at that time rezoned that Upper MacGyver Dairy, and I quote, as a placeholder zoning, that it would be revisited during the general plan update. I have quotes here from the seated members, David Tierman, Patrick Flora, Jessica Abrams, and Morgan Goodwin, all saying this is going to be revisited. We're very, very clear on that. This is not a good way to do land use planning. Not only that, but then I, as a member of the public, stood up at 2 different town council meetings and said, if you rezone this to high-density housing with the intention to readdress this later, you're going to face a takings issue. And all of these things were dismissed by the town staff and by the town lawyer. And now you're saying you can't rezone it because of state law and takings issues. And that is that is dismissing everything that you had said before. That is dismissing everybody's concerns where they were very clear. I want to read this to you, but that's too much discussion and not enough question. And it is it is a great way to lose the faith of the public to say that this can be readdressed in 2017 or 2018, and to now say that it can't be readdressed. So at this point, it just needs to be readdressed. It was 100% presented to the town council that way. So that's all I have to say on that. Does anybody else have any more comments, questions, discussion? Okay, so then I think I'm going to move to opening public comment. We all good with that? Okay. Would you guys like to say anything for public comment? You will have 3 minutes, and there's a timer over there. Please state your name if you have comments on the land use alternatives presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for this opportunity. My name is Adrian Chunkosa. I'm a 25-year resident of Glenshire, and I have 32 years of environmental consulting experience, including general plan updates. I've worked with firms just like Ascent, and in fact was a sub-consultant to them in the last couple of years, so I'm familiar with the process and the issues. I'm very positive about some of the land use alternative process, more multifamily, higher FARs, some higher density. Industrial is critical. We really need those services, and they're good jobs. So we need to provide for that, if anything, even more than we are already doing. The quality of the outline, document design, content, writing, and graphics of the briefing book are excellent. I didn't like the survey as much, but the briefing book was good. Great. I want to talk about just one thing that I have a problem with because time is limited, and that is the stated decision to leave the total number of residential units for the eastern part of Focus Area 5 the same as in the 2025 general plan. It used to be 88 units there originally, and somehow it suddenly zoomed up to 200 plus with zero analysis, zero background. This decision to leave it at somewhere over 200 is clearly incorrect for that site, as I have explained in detail in written comments. It conflicts with almost all of the 7 goals of the general plan process that are relevant to it. The correct course of action is to make an objectively based map of appropriate open space zoning, not an arbitrary one, and then determine how much development fits there and what type is appropriate. I would suggest multifamily, a concentrated multifamily development on a very small portion of the site. The briefing book says additional study is needed to reevaluate the numbers in this area, and I think that's not true. There's a ton of factual information from existing technical studies, EIRs, public comments, and public agencies to do a straightforward constraints analysis. I think there's enough support for higher numbers of residential units in other focus areas to allow for reducing the number of units there significantly and still staying within the requirements of SB 330. Notwithstanding your very apt comments about Upper MacGyver, I think that, and it's totally appropriate to reevaluate, but little islands of open space surrounded by roads and development provide relatively little environmental benefit compared with larger areas of open space that are contiguous with other environmental values that we all say that we want. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All righty. No more public comment? So I will close public comment. Then we are going to go on to item 9, which is information items, upcoming commission meetings, and agenda items from Jenna.
So we will have a meeting next month for September. I forget the date. We don't have our calendars. 21st. I believe we have one private development project, and then we will have a presentation on the Innovate Gateway project for your consideration.
Great. All right, let's move on to item number 10. Mr. Freeman, would you like to start with your commission member report?
Nothing to report.
Sorry, you said nothing to report?
Nothing to report.
Excellent. Ms. Miller?
I just have a few. I attended the virtual and in-person GPAC public meetings. For folks that weren't able to attend the in-person one, it was awesome. There were boards, you could put stickers on things, there were maps, it was really great. I wish we had many more, I'm sure we'll have many more, but I look forward to going to more. I also attended some airport meetings. I captained the bike valet for Truckee Thursday, and it looked like an ad for Rad Power bikes. There were so many e-bikes, I don't know where they're all gonna fit if we get any more popular. It was great. I was also appointed to be the comms chair for the National Academy of Sciences Transit Data Committee and submitted 2 papers. I look forward to hearing about that. And I didn't mention earlier, but I really appreciated all of the VMT greenhouse gas transit slides that were added to the deck. Those were just really awesome. So thank you again for doing that.
Excellent, thank you. I just have a few things. July 26th, I went to a green team meeting, and then after that went to the attended the online MAP land use meeting. July 29th, I went to the GPAC community workshop. That was the online one. August 3rd, I also went to the town land use open house. August 14th, I was able to take my daughter to the airport for the Young Eagles flight and pancake breakfast. And then we took our public transit over to Tahoe City to watch the Wooden Boat Challenge, where I got to meet some of the Placer County planners. So let's do a team next year. Let's build a boat and see if we can float it on the lake. And that's all I have. Thank you. All right, so I guess I get to whack this thing and we adjourn until what? What are you pointing at, Danielle?
Maybe I missed it. Did you ask Commissioner Freeman if he had done meetings? Yep. Okay, sorry.
No,
I totally was like zoned out at that part.
Okay, so I guess we will adjourn to the next meeting, which is September 21st.